One of the most sacred Montgomery County governance icons is the 1964 General Development Plan, which has controlled land use in the county for the past 5 decades, and which has produced great suburban, rural, and urban communities. Now, in a bit of unrecognized hubris, the County Council is seeking to re-envision, not reinvent, the existing general plan with a new master plan, euphemistically called Thrive Montgomery 2050. Don't you get suspicious when you hear titles like that? Thrive Montgomery 2050. On July 9th, the coalition of 29 neighborhood associations wrote to the County Council requesting significant changes to the initial draft of the Thrive Montgomery 2050 general plan. Here to discuss her concerns is Kimblyn Persaud, president of the Wheaton Regional Park Neighborhood Association, one of the signatories to that letter. Welcome back, Kimblyn.
Thank you for having me.
So according to the county website, Thrive Montgomery 2050 isn't about reinvention. It's about making sure what is great about Montgomery County continues into the future and about creating solutions to improve what needs to work better. So doesn't a 60-year-old plan need updating? Please tell us why you're seeking changes to the draft proposal.
I agree, it does need changing. It does need to be looked at, but we need it to be a deliberate, thoughtful, seen through the lens of the economic and racial equity lens. And we need all communities to be engaged in this process since it's going to determine how we live for the next 30 years. And that simply wasn't done. So this Thrive Montgomery 2050 is not a plan, it's an ideological wish list that really shouldn't even be considered right now. We are just coming out of a pandemic. We don't know how or what this is going to look like. We have a lot of office space that is not being filled. People have lost their jobs. People's lives have changed. And here we are rushing through this process. And it's actually quite shameful.
So what are the 3 key elements of the plan are economic health, equity, and environmental resilience. And we don't really have enough time to go into all 3 aspects today, but let's just talk about transportation and housing. What are your concerns about those 2 aspects of the plan?
Well, in their world, they want to create a 15-minute walkable, bikeable community called Complete Communities. The reality of that is that they want you to walk to work, do your shopping, your services, and then walk back home. You have to have jobs in order to do that. And there's no jobs. So the first order of business is to have jobs. And then you're talking about this walkable, bikeable community. Well, every community is different. The community that I live in, Wheaton, people are in the service industry and rely on their jobs as not just a mode of transportation, but that is their jobs. They're the landscapers. So they need their vehicles to get to and from work. So this is not being realistic to have this 15-minute walkable community, walkable, bikeable community, when the reality is we don't have jobs in our community that would sustain us to have these housing. And we're not going to give up our cars. This is a suburb, period. And the problem, and we're not going to be able to walk and bike down Georgia Avenue in these major thoroughfares. It's dangerous, not realistic.
Well, and there are other parts of the county that aren't really sort of conducive, like the western part of the county around Poolsville, right, and the northern part of the county as you get up towards Boyd's and those areas. But doesn't it make sense in an era where we need additional development and we need affordable housing that we try to create these types of communities?
Well, the only problem is that it does not create affordable housing. And they moved away from that to attainable housing. Attainable for who? So what they're proposing is to eliminate single family homes and in their place put up duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes on these R60s. And so the reality is, you're driving up our property values, you're increasing our property taxes, and what's going to happen is that people are not going to be able to afford to live here, especially the low income immigrant community that's here in Wheaton and White Oak. So their plan doesn't solve any of the problems that they're purporting to solve.
But we only have about a minute left. So how is the transportation portal affected by this plan?
Well, the transportation portal it's affected. It's not existent. I mean, it's not realistic. The BRT, where do you even start with this? It's just, the plan is incomplete and it should not even be discussed. We have bigger and serious things to discuss with this fallout with the pandemic.
So as we wrap up this segment, Kim, and I appreciate your coming on today, it seems that one of the key components is there's been a lack of transparency and a lack of citizen involvement. Is that your impression as well?
Yes, because it's a blanket. What they did was just a blanket view of Montgomery County. Every community is different. They did not go into every community and speak to the community to see what our needs are. Wheaton, for example, where I live, we have the complete community. We have the different variations of housing income. We have racial equity. We have it all right here in Wheaton, yet they're trying to change it and push people out.
Well, Kim, thank you for bringing this to our attention, and thank you for being here today. We appreciate your comments, and thank you for being on the show. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to bring in our regular panelist, and I'm going to start with former council member Mike Knapp. Mike, you may have heard in my discussion with Kimblyn that at the very end, I brought up the question about process. And my question is about the process that's being followed. And this past year has been unusually difficult for citizens to express their concerns regarding government proposals. Zoom may work for a lot of things, but it doesn't always work in public policy. So has the council and the planning board been transparent with its plans? And has the lack of public in-person meeting produced or reduced citizens' involvement here?
Well, I mean, I think there's always a challenge when you're addressing land use. People feel very impassioned about land use in Montgomery County. And I think that this process started back in 2019. And I think people have laid it out. That's when the planning for this began. I think that there's an element of those people who like to show up in person. As chair of the college, one of the things we found over the course of the last year and a half is we've actually been able to get much better engagement with using things like Zoom to be able to pull people into meetings that we wouldn't typically get participation for. So it's hard for me to say exactly how they've done relative to what they would have done in person, but I would say that practically, you can reach more people taking a virtual environment than you can actually hoping that they all line up outside the door at the planning board and come in and get their 2 minutes just to wave their sign and to make their 2-minute statement. So I think that there's an opportunity there, and I think that there's a level of transparency that still doesn't necessarily make people feel any better about the passion they feel in land use. And oftentimes I've found that with that passion, no matter which way you go, they're going to be upset by it. So if they could get more people in this way, they're going to be upset because they couldn't show up in person. If they could show up in person, we didn't provide people enough access because the room didn't have enough capacity. So it's Montgomery County, and I found that generally you're not going to win either way you go.
Well, that may be true, but I also think that in the pandemic era, people were focused on other things rather than governance, and they may have overlooked the fact that this plan was being debated. I know, and you know, I did have a surprised look on my face when you said it was 2019 when this plan was first proposed. I remember when it was first proposed, but I thought it was more recent than that, and I really didn't think that it has been fully open and discussed. So we can talk about the transparency issue, but Mark, there's so many elements involved in this plan today. And as you heard us talking to Kimblyn, you know, we focused on housing and transportation. So what are your initial reactions to the plan?
I think Kimblyn put her finger on one of the key flaws to the plan, which is its deeply ideological nature. A lot of the assumptions that the planners make are really not examined. In particular, we were asked about housing. There really is not evidence to support the assumption that's made, and that's really an assumption, that higher density and more regulation is going to produce more affordable housing. I challenge the advocates to show me a jurisdiction around the country where that's been the case. What it has led to is housing that has required more subsidy in order to make it affordable, which has obviously its limitations, but doesn't allow for economical housing to be generated, economic housing to be generated.
So I've also looked at the other, as I mentioned when I'm discussing it with Kimblyn, the three key components of economic health, equity, and environmental resilience. You know, I often wonder, Mike, whether the council is concerned about things that are of lesser importance to the general public. And I wonder whether or not the master plan should be put to the voters before being adopted, as opposed to just being rubber stamped and approved by the council and the county executive.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say it's not rubber stamped. And typically this gets readdressed about every 30 years. So the first plan was passed in 1964, was revised in 1993. And now we're looking about 30 years after that to begin to make further revisions. So I think it is worthwhile for us to look at that. We live in a very different county than we did in 1964. And the general plan really is to guide how master plans are put together. So it's not the master plan, it's to be able to set out what are the processes that make this work and what are the key elements. And so I think that, you know, land use is there, it's decided and is governed by the district council, which is the county council. And I think that's probably the best way to do it, just because they're at least paying attention to all of the moving parts that go into that. Most people don't really understand the elements of land use, and to put it to a vote broadly across the county, I think you get very little participation, and those that did show up, I think, wouldn't really know what they were voting on.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen in the petition process that we've had in the past, there has been good turnout, especially during an election year, that draws, you know, considerable interest from the general public. I mean, the most recent being the changes we made to the county charter in this past election, expanding from the 9 members to 11. But we have to go because we have other topics we want to talk about, and Susan and Carolyn will cut off my microphone if I don't start talking about them. And when we come back from this short break, the county council goes all in on 5G despite public concerns. Stay tuned.